Welcome back to the Doc Talk podcast. This is proudly produced in partnership with the Ottawa Rowing Club. I'm your host, Zach Lewis, and I started this podcast with the goal of fostering the community that surrounds our sport of rowing. I hope to do so through a variety of concise and insightful conversations from individuals from all over the rowing world, past and present. Rowers, coaches, practitioners of the sport, and members of our community will be sharing their knowledge and their stories with the goal of educating, inspiring, and motivating our listenership. I'm excited to be able to share today's guest with you. He is not a name that you might be familiar with from watching World Rowing videos on YouTube, and you may not know him unless you're actually from the Toronto area or having rowed at the University of Toronto. But he has amassed a pretty incredible collection of rowing stories over the years, and I think you'll really enjoy our conversation. Today's guest has recently published Blues Before Sunrise, a collection of stories about the University of Toronto rowing program, its rowers, and of course, the coaches that it includes. It highlights a variety of decades and touches on things like the inception of the program, the integration of a women's team in the early 70s, championship crews, life lessons, and a list of every person that's ever rowed for U of T. Talk about a big undertaking. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Patrick Okens to share his story with us. Welcome, Patrick. Welcome, Pat. Hope you're doing well. Where are you joining us from today?
I'm in Toronto, and I've had an interesting past few days. I came to Toronto because I live in Burlington, but we had the launch of my book at the Argonaut Rowing Club on Saturday, and it was quite the feat considering we were up against. It's funny, the MC noted that we were probably the only event in Toronto on Saturday night that didn't have the Leafs game on.
Very true.
And yet we had a turnout of about 200 people spanning the past 63 years of rowing at U of T, and I think that really speaks to the depth of the love and the commitment that people had for their time rowing at U of T.
Yeah, most certainly. How did you promote the event? Internally, or did you have personal social media, or what?
I mean, I did myself, of course, and university did their bit, and a fair bit of word of mouth. Obviously, people will come because of their friends, not necessarily because an email landed in their inbox from a university, right? So, I think that's a large part of it, and it's one of these things where the university administration, as is normal for these things, expects a drop off between the people who RSVP to actually show up. And in our case, it was actually the reverse. The attendees far exceeded the RSVPs.
Well, that's fantastic. I'm sure it's a testament to the work and to the program that you so deeply researched for your book. And I'll get to that in just a sec. But I usually like to start off by asking guests on the show how they got into the sport of rowing. So can you tell us a little bit, or our listeners a little bit, about what brought you to rowing in your first couple of years, and what's kind of kept your passion flame ignited for the last little while?
I think a significant share of our membership, there's a strong family connection. My father's a rower like his father before him. My dad learned to row in Germany, but when he came to Canada, his landing spot for rowing was the Dawn Rowing Club of Mississauga. And then eventually
Is that taboo now that you guys are
what do you mean?
at Argos? Well, just Dawn Rowing Club. I feel like that's kind of across the city from Argos. Big rivalry.
That's really interesting, Zach. And I think things have moved on to the super tribal way things used to be several generations ago. And I think as so many of us have experienced, our communities become more open and friendlier, and there's a lot of cross-pollination against all of us. Yep. And that's particularly true in the Toronto area. You stick around Toronto long enough, and depending on what stage of life you're at, and that's certainly true for me. I started out as a kid at the Dawn Rowing Club of Mississauga, typical dad needs a coxswain sort of situation, and then moved on to the Bantam program. And as a junior, I was on the credit at the same time as Michelle Darville and Silken Lauman as they were being coached by Fred Luke and others. So I got to see that growing up. And then where I went to school was the University of Toronto. And at the time, U of T was training out of the Argonaut Rowing Club. And so in summers, that was my summer club as well. But then we had one interlude where we then went and rowed at the Hanlon Boat Club, which is at the other end of Toronto.
Yep.
So for so many of us, our experience of rowing in the Toronto area is really a mix and match of rowing at Dawn's, rowing at Argonauts, rowing at the Hanlon Boat Club. And that's how you really get to see the changing nature of the city over time, of the waterfront, and actually a also just different experiences of the sport of rowing. And I think a lot of that informs my thinking about how the book would be. But for the purposes of answering your question, I rowed at U of T. I was good enough to row with good athletes, if that makes any sense. I probably wasn't the strongest guy. In fact, my first year I was cut. I wasn't good enough. But I hung around as the spare part. And sure enough, someone broke a wrist literally the day before OUs. And so I was pressed into service and we got a medal out of that. And that sort of launched me forward, and was lucky in my time at U of T to be part of some OU winning crews, a Dadville winning crew, and some Royal Canadian Henley winners as well. So, that wasn't all my doing. Like I said, I was part of rowing with a really strong group of guys, a few of whom did go on to become national team athletes, but really it was the sum being greater than, or how's it work? Anyway, 2 plus
Greater
2
than
added
some
up
of
to
its
5.
parts.
We had guys who maybe on their own weren't as strong, but together tended to outperform. And so that was also a really special part of my experience. And all of that fed directly into why I wanted to study this phenomenon as a graduate student in history. So I don't know if can I continue from there, or do you want? I'll just
Yeah, no, I think that's the fantastic way of tying it all together. And I'm sure that if you were to have, if coaches in their coach boats had cameras on their phones like everybody does now, or rather if they were even carrying
Mm-hmm.
phones, you would have this wonderful collection yeah, I'm blanking on the word, but the collection of photos from along the Toronto skyline at different perspectives, right?
Yeah.
Collage
Yeah.
is what I was looking for. My
Yeah,
apologies.
for sure.
But the first couple chapters to your book, I think, speak to that cross-pollination, to the different perspectives of not only U of T rowing, but rowing across Toronto. Now, I would love for you to kind of introduce your book as a whole. So Blues Before Sunrise, it's this wonderful collection of I guess, I don't know if they're lost rowing stories, because I'm sure there's a lot that people don't know, but they kind of serve as the bedrock for what the University of Toronto program is and stands for now. Can you introduce it a little bit, kind of in your own words, and then maybe talk about why you wanted to write it? And I mean, you just touched on the ideas and where they came from, but I'll pass it over to you before I step on all your toes.
No, fair enough. So the origin of this, of course, was I was a student in history and peace and conflict studies at U of T at the same time as being a varsity athlete. And the strongest experience I had from university, like for so many of us, was actually rowing. It wasn't the classroom or being in the stacks. And so I thought, well, why don't I try combining the two? And so as my master's thesis at U of T, I did my actual master's thesis on the history of the University of Toronto rowing team.
Okay.
Which happened, this would have been 1997, happened to be 100 years old at that time. U of T rowing had started originally back in 1897. And so I gathered up a bunch of material, spent a lot of time in the stacks, and 2 years later emerged with a master's thesis. And then that kind of filed away. I went and did other things. I stayed in rowing, actually. I was executive director of Row Ontario for 6 years, straight out of graduate school, which is a little bit freakish, but that's what I did.
That's a heck of an undertaking. They found the right fool for the job, eh?
Yeah, I guess, right? So I did that, and then I went on and worked for the Vancouver Olympic Games. So I was in event management, and in between maintained my connection to rowing, less as an athlete, but more as a coach there now and then. And then when I came back to Toronto after a time in Vancouver, the advancement people at the kinesiology faculty kind of knew that I'd done a thesis and it was kind of out there, and asked me if I would write a book. And I knew that I wanted that to be different than something with a bunch of footnotes and kind of theoretical frameworks and all of the stuff you have to do as an academic.
Yep.
I wanted this to be something that would be smart for sure, but also would engage people into understanding. So not just really engage the mind, but engage the heart and really get people to expand on why this thing was so important to them for so long, over so many years. And short story long, I was asked to do this in about the spring of 2020. And guess what we were all doing in the spring of 2020? Not much, right? The pandemic was on. And in an odd way, that was... for most people, that was terrible. For someone who is trying to get time with people face to face, to talk about human connection and how building relationships with other people and forming bonds and community was really important to them was actually super easy in that sense. People were more reflective about what community meant to them. And so what I did is I found 60 people, 60 U of T rowers who had rowed at U of T between 1960 and 2020, men and women, lightweight, heavyweight, port, starboard, scull, coxswains, the whole gamut, coaches and athletes, and spent about an hour on Zoom with each of them, and got them to talk to me about how they got into the sport, what their U of T experience was like, what it all meant to them ever since, what were they up against, what did they want, and then thought about and took all of that, transcribed the key parts, and then tried to come up with a structure that made sense.
Yep.
And that structure, as you will have seen from having seen the advanced copy, was really, in terms of the text, was 4 parts. It was sort of old history, the olden, the black and white era before any of us were alive. And we'll talk about that a bit. Another part was about the waterfront and how, depending on when you rowed at U of T, you were there at a different place. And as any of us know in rowing, our impression of the sport really imprints on the physical environment that we're active in.
Absolutely.
And so for me, growing up on the Credit River, which is a sheltered waterway, not a lot of wind, but a lot of turns and a lot of obstacles that you have to sort of negotiate. Very different experience than rowing out on the practically open lake of the Outer Harbor at Hanlon, or somewhere in between if you're at Argonauts. And so it was really important to me to talk to people whose experiences were reflected those different environments, because we're really all over the place in terms of our history. There's no serious continuity, like, say, at Ottawa. Well, maybe I'm not even right about this, but presumably most people who rowed at the Ottawa Rowing Club remember the river in a certain way, and maybe that hasn't changed so much over the years. But whereas rowing in Toronto in a changing waterfront is changing all the time. So that was another section of the book. And a similar thing holds for the campus, because again, depending on when you were a student at U of T, you had to train in a very different facility. We had the one, Hart House, which was created in 1920. We have the Athletic Center that was created in 1980. And we have the very latest facility, the Goldring Center, and a few other places that were created several decades later. So again,
Yep.
very different physical environments for something that's really important and a bit of a crucible for all of us. It's winter training in Ontario, and a lot of time on rowing machines and doing weights, and a bit of a proving ground for how committed are you to the sport when it isn't that pretty or feel that good. And finally, of course, people. A chapter, a rags to riches story of our club's story has been a struggle often, and some people had to take that challenge on and start the thing from scratch several times. The story of U of T, women's rowing at U of T, was a fascinating one. It's our biggest chapter in the book.
Mm-hmm.
A chapter about cycling, if you can believe it or not, which is really about called Get Up and Go. It's about getting down to the lake through often sketchy neighborhoods. And it's a hard thing to do before 5 a.m. when you don't have a car and you might not even know the city or even know why you're doing this, because you're a novice and don't even know the people you're going to be meeting up with.
Yep.
People's first encounter with rowing or U of T rowing, that's always a really fun thing. How did you get into the sport? You get some really great stories out of that. And then, sort of concluding with sort of the what it all means things. And I've got some nice bonuses also. Lots of pictures of our Olympians over the years, pictures of some of our champions, and giving some words of wisdom on what it takes to win or what their season was like. And I like the conclusion at the end. We have a list of all 2,800 of our alumni in the book. So anyone who has ever rowed at U of T will see their name in print in the book and get maybe the satisfaction, the blast from the past from seeing a name that they haven't seen or thought of in many years.
Well, and so that leads into my next question. But I gotta say that if you've got 2,000 alumni and you're getting 260 out to a book signing event, you got a pretty good ratio right there. I think that's an advancement officer's dream to get 10% of the outreach to any event. So congratulations on that.
Thanks. I think it might have taken U of T aback a little bit, but I think again, it just speaks to our sport. And I don't think this is just a U of T thing. I think I'd like to imagine that the rowing teams at any university and their alumni are probably the most engaged and committed, because I think it takes a fair bit more. Like, we're not on campus. There's more that you have to do to get out there.
Yep.
And because of the pain and the intensity involved, I think that imprints on us pretty strongly. And that's something I think we should be, and I think we do leverage. And it probably makes us a bit more of a pain in the behind for administrators, because we're more demanding maybe and we expect more. But at the same time, I think it's what's made our experiences so important and so valuable at universities throughout the country.
No, most certainly. I must say, one of the things that really struck me when I was reading your book, as you just alluded to, particularly in the last chapter, which I believe you entitled Finishing Strong, was how well so many of the U of T records have been kept. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to be involved with a multitude of collegiate rowing programs over the years. And I've got to say, actually, I've got to ask, how much digging was required to pull out the 2,000 names? But not only that, the storylines. I mean, you talked a little bit about the interviews with various candidates who rowed from the 60s onwards, but you still have a pretty in-depth description of rowing in the 20s and the 30s when it first came to campus. And I mean, Ned Hanlon being the first coach is a storyline in and of itself. But
Mhm.
I mean, how much of this was documented and how much this was anecdotal? Where did you find all your sources? Talk to me a little bit about the research that actually went into the fact checking of the book.
For sure. You're right. I think I'm not quite sure where to begin on that. Well, let's think of some of the people I had to thank. Let's do it this way. Within U of T, it's a gigantic institution, which is both an advantage and a disadvantage
Mm-hmm.
as you're trying to get anything done there. A key contributor to the success, of my thesis, but then also of the book, was the U of T archives.
Mm-hmm.
And if you ever want to do it, maybe a good tip for anybody who wants to write their club's history, is to make friends with an archivist. Find out who the people are who work in those places, because they know those documents intimately well. They know where to find the stuff that you, as a sort of an outside researcher, will have a harder time doing unless you get a Sherpa into those worlds. And so the archivist that I work with back then for my thesis and now for this book led me to a trove of archives. The memoirs of Tommy Loudon, who was a legendary coach a century ago, himself the first coxswain of a Canadian crew at the Olympics, and his U of T crew ended up being Olympic silver medalists. Anyway, he had a huge memoir, so that was unpublished, but so that really helped, and several images from that time. But frankly, there's a lot of donkey work. You have to be pretty dogged at it. And I think that's something that we as rowers should leverage to our advantage. If you find, we're obsessed about our sport anyway, and you combine that with people who are willing to go spend a lot of time going through microfiches to find old articles, and then that's how you start digging. You find a name, and then, okay, you put that into the internet, and then you find something else, and then it starts to come together, right?
Yep.
And so things like that are really important. And if you want to get beyond the surface, you have to do the hard work of finding those people and then contacting them and then setting up all of that process stuff that serves us well in rowing. I think makes at least some people in each of our clubs the right person to do this sort of thing for their communities. And I have to really give a shout out to a fellow U of T rowing alum, Olivier Sorin. And he wrote after I did, but he did his PhD in archival studies or library science.
Mm-hmm.
So the getting the names of all 2,800 plus of us, that was I thought I was obsessive and detailed oriented about U of T rowing, and I had nothing on that guy. I mean, he went down so many rabbit holes, databases, bankers boxes. He begged everyone to provide their old roster lists, lists of erg scores or whatever, because then that can then be fed into databases to then find the names of the people that you then combine.
Hmm.
And again, those names on their own can be marketing gold, but beyond that, I think just that you're remembered and recognized as being part of a community can be really special for people.
Absolutely.
So I was really lucky to have that opportunity, but I had a lot to work with. But no one should kid themselves that it's point, click, find everything. I think there's a lot of donkey work to get to that, and it didn't
Well,
happen instantly.
well, it's point click now because you've already done the donkey work. But for the next guy or the next woman,
Exactly right.
you've done it for them.
Yeah.
Well, like it's interesting that you mentioned process because that theme kind of comes up several times in the book. And one of the quotes that I've actually got written down that I really appreciated was from Blues alum George Gage, who is now
Yeah.
maybe retired now, but was a lawyer and a judge for a long time.
Yes.
And his quote was that the necessity for preparation and practice was ingrained in him by the sport of rowing. He claims that the sport offered his approach or shaped his approach to trial preparation, and stated that he was thankful for rowing because it made him do that and it gave him access to other real life skills that he still uses today. And I think you touched on that again with rowing does provide an enormous amount of support and life skills for people that are going through regular life. It doesn't necessarily have to translate to rowing forever. But I mean, as an athlete myself, or student athlete, I was considerably better academically while I was rowing. It provided the structure, the support, the ecosystem that I needed. My teammates and friends were there. My coaches were there. It made me go to sleep on time. It made me eat properly. Kind of
Yeah.
all of the residuals that came with being part of this fantastic sport that, as weird as it is when you're getting up at the butt crack of dawn and working your ass off in the cold and nobody else really gets it unless they're part of it. But there are so many transferables that come from rowing. And I think that's why our sport is so connected and so dedicated. And I also preach that as being an important part of our practice as coaches and administrators and facilitators of the sport now.
Yeah, that's an important thread. George is pretty much a lifer in the sport. He's still active as a masters rower at the Leander Boat Club.
Mm-hmm.
And he was there at the book launch too. And so, but one thing I guess just I want to also, this probably resonates with you too. One thing that slightly surprised me, but in retrospect didn't, is that there are some people who showed up to that event that really only had 1 or 2 years in rowing, like they did novice rowing and maybe a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered why would somebody show up to something like this if they didn't end up continuing on for years and years? And the responses I got were that, yeah, I didn't continue on as a rower, but the impact was so disproportionate to the amount of time I was actually in it
Mm-hmm.
that it was still a super valuable and memorable experience, to have an important experience for those people to have done it. And one of the things I hope that the book does, of course, it can be a bit of an exercise in nostalgia and good feeling for all of us who are there. I also think of it as a forward-looking thing to help, for current team members or for any of us that have been there that, are our friends or our family who don't really understand, why we cared so much about this thing. Hopefully, a book like this can provide some of that insight, because, as you know, family support so crucial to being able to sustain such an intense endeavor. And if you don't have it, it can be even more difficult.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that I think that's part of why I did the book as well. And, I think I note this in the introduction. In addition to all the things for those of us that from the past, it's a nostalgia thing. I hope that there's some people who don't even know about rowing yet, who pick up this book and read it and think, I want some of that. That sounds like a lot of fun. I want to take that on. So I really see this also as a forward thinking thing, or projecting it forward, that it'll help enhance the value or or at least the reputation of our sport. Something that really makes a transformative experience of university, which can actually be really challenging, particularly in Toronto, which is such a massive city, a massive institution, sometimes really impersonal. And this is where you can find who your people are.
Well, there's also so much going on in a city like Toronto, right?
Yeah, I mean, there is, for good or ill.
True.
It's
You can sink away in the shadows and nobody will know where you are, what you're doing.
Yeah, right. And you can get, I think one of the lovely evocative quote, you can feel like you're just another chip on the bottom of the hamster's cage in the city. But when you're part of a community and you're needed and you're actually essential to a boat going out on the water, uh, one of the thing about the chapter on cycling down to the lake that I found really interesting is people really pushy and kind of energetic about it, and sometimes take more risks. And every year someone breaks bones on a bike. Is the
Those
sort of thing that
friggin'
happens.
trolley tracks, eh?
Yeah, because the streetcar tracks and just everything else. But part of it is like being late or letting your teammates down is just something you learn, is you can't do, or you won't stay in the sport. And that's a really intense way of forming connection and being getting a real sense of why you're important to a community.
Yep.
And so that's why that chapter is in there, even though it's not really about rowing. Ultimately, this book isn't really about rowing. It's about finding out who you are and finding out who your friends are, by taking on challenges together.
I love that theme, and it's certainly something that I picked up on while doing it. And I also understand the importance of community. It's something that I preach regularly in Ottawa as a coach here and building up our club programs. But as an athlete, knowing you're the guy that's not going to be in the boat or is going to be late for the boat is just something that just brings that sinking feeling or that pit in your stomach where you're like, oh man, you better
I have
gear
a
up
quote,
on the
yeah.
bike or
Yeah.
yeah,
There's a quote in there of a guy who had never been late for practice, and he was late one time, and his crew left without him, and he was in tears on the dock watching his guy, and he couldn't look at them in the eye when they came back. It was a really dramatic moment for him, but kind of poignant. And I felt like that too. Like I don't want to be the one who lets the team down.
For sure. I'm now 7 or 8 years into professional coaching, and I've yet to have a day where I've slept in for practice as a coach.
Mm-hmm.
But something in the back of my mind tells me that it's inevitable that if I continue with this, that at some point it's going to happen. And
Yeah.
it's just like, there are nights when I'll wake up 3, 4, 5 times at like 1:15, 2:15, 2:35,
Oh yeah. Oh my God.
3 o'clock.
Yeah.
And you're like, is it time yet? Have I missed my alarm? Oh shit. Like, oh frig, don't let it be today. But so fingers crossed. You heard it here first. It's going to happen at some point, but I completely understand the guilt, but the sense of the community that comes with it as well.
For sure.
There are an incredible amount of storylines and very unique perspectives. And I think you just touched on a few of those things, as you'd expect from any program with 130 plus years of history. But were there any that stuck out to you, or even just interviews that stuck up to you as exceptionally captivating, or perhaps something that the average Canadian rowing junkie wouldn't know?
So many, like it's hard to pick out any. I loved being able to talk with the three of the women who were part of the first ever women's crew at U of T. And in Toronto, we were kind of late to the game. The first U of T women's crew, that was 1974.
Mm-hmm.
And intercollegiate women's rowing. I'm not clear on the history, and I'm sure someone could clarify this. But women started rowing, I think, at Western and at Brock years before. I mean, not many years, but several years before they did in Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
And hearing from those women, who all, by the way, still row to this day,
Very cool.
About how important and life-defining and affirming it was for them. Remember, I mean, this is still at a time where these people's mothers were in some ways horrified that their daughters were taking on this apparently, unwomanly or unfeminine sport.
This
But they were
brutal undertaking.
Yeah, so you had to take that challenge on and overcome the perception of that you're becoming your own person. And at the same time that they had allies, the men's team were all on board with them being part of it, because they were reforming a U of T rowing program that had disappeared for a couple of years. And so that first year was a ragtag effort. There were 3 people who had any rowing experience. And of course, that means you're going up, as essentially novices up against Western and losing by, a time zone's worth of open water. But the glee that they got from just feeling that they were able to get out there and do it. And in fact, from the that group of women, in fact, women weren't allowed to be at the Argonaut Rowing Club. There was no women's rowing. So this was kind of done clandestine, sort of under the cover of darkness before the old boys would get up in the morning. And anyway, so just hearing that story, I found really, really interesting. And I'm so glad it happened, because, again, this was one of these digging efforts where, I find a name, and then, you put something in on LinkedIn, and then I remember I found one of the women because it turned out I had worked with her sister. They happened to have the same last name, and I thought, well, maybe are they about the same? And it was just so happy when that actually happened. So, um, so that's an example of one. I can think of many others, but then I'll probably end up giving you 63 different examples. Just go
No,
with
that's
that.
okay. No, that's fantastic. I was surprised, and pleasantly so, when I was reading the chapter about women's rowing being inaugurated at U of T, that there didn't seem to be a lot of opposition. I mean, for whatever reason, and in hindsight now, it's always such a stupid reason when we're talking about women's sports, whether it's them
Mhm.
finally rowing 2,000 meters for the first time, or whether it's them being
Mhm.
involved in rowing at all, or any sport for that matter. And there
Mhm.
always just seemed to be such objection to it, which now seems, ridiculous. But at the time, it was the norm. And I was, again, pleasantly surprised that there seemed to be so much support from the at least U of T men's rowing
I
community.
think that's the important distinction. This was that effort, women's rowing in Toronto, or at U of T in particular, was a bottom up effort.
Mhm.
Um, there was active opposition from the powers that be at the Argonaut Rowing Club at the time,
Yep.
and there was passive or unenthusiastic or tepid support from the university administration when it comes to women's rowing. Um, and I think really the lesson that I took from that is there was for a very long time there has been a strong culture within U of T rowing of doing things ourselves and not really expecting much or getting much from the institutional support from
Yep.
the top, or at least knowing that you can get some, but really if you want to get it done, you have to do much of it yourself. And that was certainly true of that group of athletes. I'm not a sociologist and I was barely born at the time, so I don't know what the times were like, but I get the sense that between the men's group and the women's group, this a little bit after the 1960s, there's a bit of feeling of the power of the people and young people moving forward together to make things happen. So the feeling of optimism and change and that they can do things themselves. And that's why I called that chapter The Spirit of 74.
I love that. One of the last things I wanted to ask you about was I really enjoyed reading about the U of T McGill race history. So I know the present U of T coach Mark Williams and the present McGill coach Phil quite well, and they were both pretty excited about getting this challenge going again. This
Yes.
past year, I think was the first time they've had it in decades.
It's happening this weekend in
Oh,
Montreal.
okay, so it's about to happen. So we're
Yeah.
recording first
Oh,
week
yeah,
of May.
well,
So this is
yeah.
going to be May 6th or 7th in Montreal, which
Correct.
is
Yeah.
fantastic.
Right.
I also had no idea that it was originally on the Lachine Canal. So the Lachine, or the Défi du Canal, or the Lachine Canal race is something that we as the Ottawa Rowing Club still go to.
Okay.
It's at the end of May. It's always the last Sunday of the month. It's a great time for
Yeah.
anybody in the area. Come row it. Come check it out. It's a lot of fun. But I've never seen a university crew there. So reading about that and reading about the crowds and the people that were coming out of the
Yeah.
U of T McGill football game and seeing,
Yeah.
30, 40,000 people on the side of the river was it's unheard of now. But
Right. Yeah.
you read about, well, if you go to the Charles, I guess it's probably the exception, or the
Sure.
Oxford Cambridge
Yeah.
boat race, but you don't see that anymore.
No, it's that's an interesting thing. I guess the history geek in me would say that we're always looking at themes of continuity and change,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, the truth is that this Toronto McGill boat race wasn't always on the Lachine Canal.
Mm-hmm.
It started out kind of first as sort of the McGill guys came to Toronto and they raced on the Toronto waterfront.
Okay.
1 year, and then I forget the exact sequence, but they went to St. Catharines and did it another time there, just a head-to-head race between the two of them. So it bounced around a little bit before they landed on what they seemed to be a winning formula on Lachine Canal. And just for the record, that was a 2-mile race, so 3.2 kilometers, give or take, side by side, 2 varsity boats down the canal.
Mm-hmm.
And that happened until I think it was 1935. And then it folded. The McGill head coach passed away, unfortunately, and had a hard time putting things together. And then but for 5 or 6 years, there was the Governor General of Canada, the Chancellor of McGill University, the President of the University of Toronto. This was kind of a big deal for them, at least compared to now. I think we'd have a harder time getting those that sort of brass out to rowing events these days.
Yep.
And Canada was also a smaller place. right? I mean, there were fewer other things going on, and this Oxbridge-ish type thing maybe meant more at a time when Canada was a lot more connected to the British Empire than we are now.
True.
So yeah, and so there's that. So anyway, that happened through the 1930s, and then it went away. And then McGill rowing came back. It was in the 1970s, and now with the knowledge, I guess, from my thesis and so on, that there was this thing, um, they decided to try to revive it, and so I'm really pleased that that's happening. And in fact, though, what I've learned is that the plan is not to have it this year on the Lachine Canal, but I guess in front of the Lachine Rowing Club, so on a stretch. I think that would be right on the St. Lawrence River.
Cool.
And I'm okay with that. I mean, it'd be fun to do it on Lachine Canal, and hopefully they will at some point. But it's in keeping with the history that it kind of bounces around a bit before they find something that really works. And I think the idea is to have alternating years between Toronto at the Argonaut Rowing Club and somewhere in Montreal. So there's time for this thing to evolve, and it has to fit what the students, the kids, the teams today want to make of it. The idea is not to be so completely bound up in the past. It's to take some of the best parts of it and spin it forward to what works for people 90 years later.
Absolutely. Well, I hope more than anything that they bring back the varsity jackets from those years, because I've seen photos, and the U of T jackets were white with a navy trim, and the McGill jackets were the bright red. They look top notch.
I'm not a fashion plate, but this is a thing that we actually did, and so I've got one. We recreated it, a couple of us, and now it's a little bit of a pilot project, and I think there's interest, and so that'll be the next step to do. And I think probably at future U of T rowing alumni events, we'll be seeing more people in those white blazers with blue trim.
Well, fantastic! I love it. Okay, last question for you, then I promise to let you go because I know you're busy. There was a pretty distinguished list of alumni from U of T. So you mentioned there's 2,800 names, but just going through, there's Olympians and coaches and world champions from U of T kind of across the era, right from, I believe it was 1924, your men's 8 went to the Olympics as a whole, back when the national selection was just a challenge of the fastest crew. You've since had Michael Brathwaite, Michelle Darville, Tarek Beans training with the men's team right now. Was there anybody that jumped out to you? Were you surprised that there were this many U of T alumni from a program that, as you mentioned, hasn't traditionally year over year been as strong as the Brocks or the Trents or the Westerns or the UBCs or whatever? To have so many people that have come through this program and go on to represent Canada in one facet or another is pretty exceptional.
Yeah, I think it's important to celebrate that. Winning isn't everything, but it's important. It's an important factor. And if you're pursuing excellence, we should be celebrating and recognizing the people among us who've been among the best, and in fact, the best in the world. I mean, we do have 3 Olympic champions. Roger Jackson was a gold medalist in the pair in 1964. Patrick Turner was in the men's 8 in 1984 in Los Angeles. And 1992, Kay Worthington, of course, was our double gold medalist in Barcelona. And Michelle Darville was a U of T rower as well. And of course, she's not an Olympic champion herself, although she rowed at the Olympic Games. She is a world champion, and she's, of course, the coach of the Canadian women's 8. So we claim her as an Olympic gold medalist.
Hey, I still think she's the only lightweight woman to ever win the single, the double, and the quad at world champs. So that's a claim to fame even in of itself. And
she's done it for 2 different countries too. I think it's kind of it's interesting that there is that. So I think that's it's important to recognize those people, and in many ways, it's important to acknowledge those starting points. Those people weren't obviously ever going to be Olympians or Olympic gold medalists. As you know, as a coach, there are no foregone conclusions. This comes from a lot of work by a lot of people over time, and people and coaches and clubs who give people their start. And it may not be that itself was the experience that led them straight to the podium. That was the launching pad to what was next. And I think it's important to recognize those things. And in fact, so that was an important chapter section in the book. And also to say that, there's 2,800 of us. We have 3 Olympic champions. The rest of us aren't chopped liver. I think there's plenty of worthwhile, important storylines and things that are in some ways as impressive, if not more impressive, than being an Olympic champion. And I think I wanted to humanize the story also for those people that who were Olympic gods, maybe for a day or two. That there was something far more important, or that maybe that's not the right way to put it, but that they went on and did other things with their lives too. Right now, so I didn't want this to be just a potted, here are a list of our champions and a bunch of names, and sort of be very two-dimensional that way. I wanted to really give a full-rounded experience of what it's like to be human at this university and in the city on this waterfront.
I love it. Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you for sharing the advanced copy with me. I'm sure, is it available now?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
perfect.
Yeah, so, for sure. Maybe I'll send you a link, and we'll figure out how we can do it, or you can contact me. You tell me how you want to
share the link with me, and I can post it in the show notes. And anybody that listens to the episode can go through and click on it to your website or wherever you're selling the book or wherever you've got background information or whatever. That is all the time or all the questions that I've got for you. Is there anything else that you'd like to share before I let you go?
I think I've done a lot of that right now. I'm blanking out.
You've done great. We've covered a bunch.
You know what? Here's how I'd like to do it. I hope that everyone who loves rowing for their club finds their equivalent story, finds the people who are the storytellers within their community, and creates their version of that. It doesn't have to be like mine or like ours. Find your own way, find your own story, make sure it's out there. It makes our story, our community, our sport so much richer when we tell our stories.
Beautiful. Well, I think that is a fantastic note to end it on. So thank you very much for sharing us with Patrick. I think people are really going to enjoy not only this interview, but the collection of stories that you've amassed. So thank you for continuing to promote the sport of rowing, and I think sharing so many of the better sides of it that are often lost between running to and from practice.
I enjoyed the talk. Thank you, Zach.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye. What a great chat with Patrick today. I loved his emphasis on all things community that contribute to the world of collegiate rowing and our sport as a whole. I've often found myself dreading hours on the erg. I can't begin to imagine digging through dusty archives for hours. It is a dirty job, but I'm sure glad he did it. Without people like Patrick, much of our sports history would be lost, or at the very least, not shared with the next generation, who really are the ones that benefit from knowing these things and knowing who and what came before them. I hope Patrick's work serves as an inspiration for other club and university program members to do something similar. I have no doubt that it is a mountain of work. He made that very clear. But hey, no time like the present to get started, right? Rowers aren't afraid of work. I would highly recommend you check out Patrick's book, even if you're not a huge rowing fan. It's a very easy read, not the slightest bit technical. It's got some fantastic photos from throughout the ages as well. It is a wonderful mosaic of so many aspects that play a role into making rowing happen, not just at the U of T level, but there are very consistent themes or parallel themes across a variety of rowing programs. If you've been part of a boathouse anywhere, I think you'll really appreciate this. I've made sure to share the link to his book in the show notes. Feel free to check it out. And a huge, huge thank you to Pat for joining us today, sharing all these incredible stories and the work that he's done and putting them all together in his book. It has been an absolute pleasure chatting to you and being part of your day. I hope to see you all back in our next episode when it drops in a few weeks. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd please ask that you take a moment and share it with one person in your circle that you think might enjoy it or benefit from some of the topics discussed. It would be really great if you could rate the show or subscribe on the Doc Talk channel, wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and more. If you have a future show idea or like to shoot me a note, recommend a guest, etc., please do so at doctalkpod@yahoo.com. Wishing you all a very speedy week. Until next time, this has been Doc Talk.